Hey everyone, welcome back to HeadlineLabz. Today we are diving deep into a disaster where devastating, worst-case scenario seismic science collided head-on with a nation undergoing some truly unprecedented political upheaval. We're doing a full, deep dive explainer today on the catastrophic June 2026 Venezuela twin earthquakes. We're going to look directly at the data, the geology, and of course the massive geopolitical storm that surrounded one of the most complex rescue efforts in modern history. To really wrap our heads around the reality of June 24th, you kind of have to imagine the sheer terror of the exact moment it began. As 25-year-old Caracas resident Luis Alejandro Ruiz Garcia described it to reporters, the sound was like airplane turbines. Literally, he gets a Google earthquake alert just a split second before the walls of his home crack and this violent shaking takes over. This wasn't just a tremor, right? It was an absolute roar that shattered a 126-year period without a major Venezuelan earthquake. And the scale of what followed, it's just staggering. The United Nations estimates that 6.8 million people were affected across the region. And just to put that into perspective, that includes 680,000 kids in need of immediate assistance. The shockwaves rippled way beyond the epicenter, reaching as far as Colombia and even the Brazilian Amazon, which is over 1,000 miles away. It completely paralyzed a country that honestly was already profoundly vulnerable.
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. The breaking point, anatomy of a doublet.
So, what actually happened beneath the Earth's surface that evening was a very rare and incredibly destructive sequence. Venezuela didn't just get hit by one earthquake, they experienced two massive ruptures, just 39 seconds apart. Look at this data. At exactly 1804 local time, a magnitude 7.24 shock strikes near Yumare in Yaracuy state. Literally 39 seconds later, an even larger magnitude 7.5 main shock rips through the nearby Yumare-Morón corridor. Seismologists call this a doublet. It's basically a pair of major earthquakes so close in time and space that their combined energy causes way more cumulative damage than just one single event. And because this was a shallow slip-slip fault, that energy didn't just dissipate deep underground, it violently slammed the surface, making this the strongest seismic event to hit the country since 1900. Moving on to Section 2, anatomy of the rupture and exactly why those buildings failed.
Now, what is truly chilling about this rupture is that the science community knew it was coming. Geologists had explicitly mapped out the San Sebastián Fault system as a major risk. Geophysicists actually published literature predicting this exact fault was capable of a magnitude 7.1 event. The June 24th doublet basically delivered exactly what the science warned of. But, it delivered it twice. And this brilliantly illustrates why the capital city of Caracas suffered extreme building collapses even though it's over 100 miles away from the epicenter. Caracas basically sits inside a deep sedimentary basin. Think of it like a giant bowl filled with soft sediment instead of hard bedrock. Because of a phenomenon called Basin amplification, when those seismic waves hit that soft basin fill, they slow down and drastically increase in amplitude. So the ground in Caracas essentially amplified the earthquake, creating this intense, prolonged shaking that literally tore buildings apart.
But look, the destruction wasn't just a failure of geology, right? It was a major failure of infrastructure. The specific killer here was the soft story collapse. After the 1967 Caracas earthquake, building codes were revised, but they just weren't strictly enforced. Then, after the tragic 1999 Vargas floods, replacement housing along the coast was built super fast, rushed really. A lot of these buildings had weak ground floors, like open parking garages or lobbies, with unenforced structural supports. So when the massive lateral stress of the doublet hit, those weak ground floors just gave way. This results in what engineers call a pancake collapse, where the upper floors drop completely flat onto each other. It leaves virtually zero survivable void space for anyone trapped inside. Which brings us to Section 3, a nation in transition. Let's move to and see how this builds, because to fully understand the impact of this disaster, we absolutely have to look at the geopolitical fault lines running through the country at the exact same time. Venezuela was in the middle of a historically unprecedented political transition. Just months prior, on January 3, 2026, the U.S. military executed Operation Resolve, capturing President Nicolas Maduro and transferring him to U.S. custody. 2 days later, Vice President Delcy Rodríguez is sworn in as acting president, making history as the first woman to hold the office in Venezuela. Over the next few months, her new transitional government starts restructuring social programs, passing amnesty laws, reforming oil laws, and then, on June 24th, the earth fractures. The earthquakes instantly became this massive, trial-by-fire test of Rodríguez's fragile new government, demanding a response on a scale that honestly no administration could easily handle.
And you have to keep in mind, before the ground even shook, the country's disaster response ecosystem was already severely diminished. Over a decade of economic crisis had left healthcare capacity totally strained. Surviving hospitals were immediately overwhelmed. Some literally had to treat patients outdoors. Plus, a 2024 law barring NGOs from operating without government authorization was still on the books, which severely limited independent civil society aid. And crucially, there were heavy media and internet restrictions in place. Over 200 websites were blocked, and a ban on the platform X actually had to be partially lifted just so emergency information could flow.
Section 4, the emergency response and that critical 72-hour window.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the jarring contrast between the official government narrative and what was actually happening on the ground. In disaster recovery, you have this golden 72-hour window where the chances of pulling trapped survivors out alive are at their highest. Acting President Rodríguez declared a state of emergency, and officials announced they had deployed 14,000 military personnel and over 100 pieces of heavy machinery. But on the ground, in the hardest-hit coastal towns of La Guaira, the civilian reality was just agonizing. Reporting showed residents digging through those pancake collapsed apartment buildings with their bare hands, a full 24 hours later. Heavy equipment was nowhere to be found, which prompted these uncoordinated citizen convoys from cities hours away to just drive through the night to bring aid themselves.
Recognizing this massive gap in resources, a global response did mobilize rapidly. The U.S. provided the largest single-country contribution, pledging $150 million in aid, issuing a Treasury sanctions waiver so relief transactions could happen, and deploying U.S. Southern Command assets like the USS Fort Lauderdale. Notably, President Donald Trump publicly framed this rapid military and financial response as a direct success of his administration's January regime change operation, and aid just poured in globally. Mexico sent their famous Los Topos search team with rescue dogs, and nations from Colombia to Spain to Germany flew in transport planes, field hospitals, and highly specialized rescue crews.
But even with all that global expertise, the logistical hurdles were just tragically insurmountable for a lot of people. We see this in a heartbreaking report from an 80-person Swiss rescue team. Their trained dogs detected multiple survivors beneath a rubble site. They knew exactly where living people were buried, but they reported they were completely unable to extract them in time before they passed away, simply because they lacked the specialized heavy manpower and extraction machinery required to move those massive slabs of concrete. It's just devastating. So the crucial point is Section 5, Voices from the Rubble. Because behind every satellite damage assessment and complex geopolitical timeline, there are human beings. The data honestly means nothing if we don't ground it in the reality of the people living through it. Listen to the words of Simón Medina. He was photographed digging through the rubble of La Guaira with literally nothing but gloves and a pickaxe, desperately searching for his mother and brother. He told reporters, "We are trying to find anything, to understand what happened, and to find even just a small piece. Even if we only find belongings or papers, it would be good." That is the raw, agonizing human tragedy that played out over thousands of collapsed structures. And for those who did make it out, the terror didn't just stop when the ground stopped shaking. Displaced residents were left living in tent shelters, facing these compounded threats. Luz Marina Marcano recalled her daughters pleading with her mom, "Get me out of here, we do not want to die here." They were completely terrified of going back to their cracked homes because opportunistic criminals were breaking into abandoned houses. Plus, the government recorded over 600 aftershocks in the days following the main rupture. The ground literally wouldn't let them rest.
But amidst all this immense darkness, there were these incredible micro-narratives of resilience. After 30 hours trapped in the rubble, an 18-day-old infant was pulled out alive, followed shortly by its mother. A father and his son were extracted after spending 4 grueling days buried under concrete, saved by a joint team of U.S., French, and Venezuelan workers. And on a global scale, the Venezuelan diaspora stepped up in some incredibly innovative ways. Influencer Leslie Pons actually leveraged her massive 52 million-plus follower reach to crowdsource real-time rescue maps. She asked followers to tag locations that needed help, effectively bypassing the restricted media environment to route aid exactly where it was needed most.
Ultimately, this disaster leaves us looking at a country facing monumental twin challenges. As the official death toll remains a suspected undercount and the rubble clearing grinds on, we really have to ask ourselves, when the dust finally settles on a fractured transitional government and a completely shattered infrastructure, how does a nation even begin to rebuild from the ground up? Thank you so much for focusing in with us on this HeadlineLabz Explainer. Keep analyzing the data, keep seeking out primary sources, and for sure, keep asking the hard questions. See you next time.